Hello, welcome, Parlerivsi. My name is Alice Kaniklen. I'm Inupiaq from Utqiagvik, Alaska, and you might know me from the Coffee and Quack podcast. I'm your host for Resolve, an ongoing series about missing and murdered Indigenous women in Alaska as part of a multimedia awareness campaign called Save Our Sisters Alaska, created by Affinity Films, a nonprofit media organization based in Anchorage, Alaska. With each episode, we'll be featuring one person sharing her story in the context of a more in-depth exploration of what lies beneath these hard facts. Alaska has one of the highest rates of violence against women in the United States. Indigenous women are 4 to 10 times more likely to be victims of violent crimes. There are currently over 100 unsolved cases involving missing or murdered Indigenous women in Alaska.
Justice for me would be for him to live out the rest of his life in prison. He was going to kill me that night. There was no doubt about it.
Today we'll be speaking with Anna Sattler.
Lingiwa bijigam wardam plupani ganga whasloka yukanga wanguda guihlumi munqok dawam whami Anchorage waitattunga for 21 years. So my name is Anna Sattler, and I'm originally from Guihluk. English is my second language. I've lived in town for 21 years. And so I'm very, very committed to this subject in particular because Alaska, as we know, suffers from some very unfortunate national distinctions. Alcohol, suicide, abuse, and then, of course, child sexual abuse and rape. And being from rural Alaska, most of the people that I know and grew up with, we know people or we've been a victim from childhood or as an adult. So I'm happy to help talk about this.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I was deconstructing my own feelings about it once before because I get nervous when I'm walking outside, especially like at night or when it's dark out and there are other people around. And I was really trying to think, like, why do I feel so uncomfortable? Why is it? At first, I was like, is it a race thing? Is it because they're Native, or is it because they're white, or why do I feel this way? And I kind of came to the conclusion it wasn't because of race, or it wasn't because of how they looked. It was if they were men or not. I didn't feel uncomfortable if it was a woman that I was walking by, and that kind of realization in me, I was like, wow, that is just a symptom of what is happening larger here in Alaska. And I feel like, you're kind of famous. You're our AFN. We know your face. We know, it's almost like we have a relationship with you in our homes growing up, it's like we know you. And so I'm really happy that you're willing to provide a voice to this issue and to tell this, speak truth to power.
On January 19, 2001, Anna Sattler traveled from her home in Anchorage to Soldotna, about 145 miles away on the highway, where she and friends went bar hopping. The group split up, and Sattler began talking to a man later identified by prosecutors as Carmen D. Perzacino Jr., a former dog musher and longtime Sterling resident. Perzacino offered to give Sattler a ride, and she accepted. They climbed into a vehicle that Sattler later described to troopers as a white or light-colored van with bucket seats. The body of the van had no windows. She began to feel uneasy. After Perzacino had been driving for a while, he began talking sexually aggressive to her, prosecutors wrote in charging documents. Sattler told him no, and that she wanted to go back to the bar. Perzacino's demeanor changed. He told her he was going to have sex with her. He wasn't asking. Perzacino parked in a wooded area, Sattler said. It might have been along the highway or a back road. No cars passed. She saw no house lights. When I attempted to run away from his parked vehicle, he would tackle me and drag me back, Sattler said. She remembers feeling the sting of ice on the ground after each tackle. Perzacino took her back to the van, pulled down her pants, and raped her. Afterward, as he began driving again, he asked her if anyone knew where she was. Would anyone miss her? Sattler opened the door and tumbled from the moving vehicle. She said if I was going to die that night, I was going to die by my own hands.
I want to be very careful in, what I'm saying so that nothing could ever be used against me, if that makes any sense. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But mostly what I want to do is to be able to encourage others to say something, and then beyond that, believe them and support them. It's not easy when you live essentially in a little island, in a small community, or even in a larger hub, when you're related to half the community or more, and somebody does something, because, I can understand where a family member might feel conflicted, that they want to be able to protect somebody, but they do that at the expense of the victim. And one of the things that I would like to talk about is being sexually abused at 3 and 4 years old. We have to start as a whole to start recognizing the symptoms, and then doing something about it. Because as shameful as this is for me to say, it arrested my development. I have felt almost my entire life that I was intrinsically flawed. And I would attribute 90% of that to what happened to me at 3 and 4 years old. Not being able to process as a young lady, as a preteen, as a teenager, as a young adult, not able to process and not able to look. My view of love and sex is not something that, when I was younger, that was healthy. And I attribute that to being sexually abused at 3 and 4 years old, and everybody keeping it quiet. When I finally told my German father, who raised me, about it years later, he sort of got a few things. He was able to connect a few dots. But my mother, who was living with us at the time, did not believe those, because I wasn't able to articulate what had happened, but I just kept telling my mother at 3 and 4 that I didn't want to be with that cousin who was living with us and, attending boarding school in Bethel.
Queethlook, how many people live in Queethlook?
Well, like 750, but when I was living there, it was like 350.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's huge.
There's a lot to be spoken about our upbringing in rural Alaska and how different that is to the rest of the world, even to Anchorage, how different that is. Can you speak about some of your experiences in those differences of being in a tiny village, far removed from big cities, and then living here? So you have experienced both, right?
So I grew up in Queethlook, Twinton, Platinum. My dad was a principal teacher and a pilot, but so I've spent a lot of time all over the Delta. But this is something that I have thought about for decades, and I speak to it often. But there's communication styles are so different. I mean, the biggest thing is that Yupiks especially, but I think most indigenous cultures, we do not cause waves. We're more really like communists or, Christian, that culture where you don't stick out. And in the Western culture, the the dominant race culture, you have to have good catchphrases. You have to look a certain way. You have to have a number, a certain amount of zeros in your salary, a certain amount of square footage, in order to be labeled successful. But in the traditional culture, your ideas of success are so much different. It's how well you can provide for your family and the circle, the outer circle of your family. The other big thing is, because you're not supposed to create waves, reporting and supporting is harder to do, because do I really want to point the finger? Rhonda McBride said this really well, and I'm not able to quote her word for word, but she said that in Alaska Native culture, you don't ever label somebody a bad thing, because that isn't the way they're going to be forever. Oh. So you don't want to label them something as a lawbreaker forever, because you won't give them the opportunity to change. Mm. And that really is the most healthy way to look at things. On the other hand, it's absolutely detrimental to the other person, to the victim. There has to be a better balance. So I understand that what happened to me at 3 and 4, my cousin deserves to be in jail. But on the other hand, my Yupikness is hoping that, he was 17 or 18, that he would never do it again. That he made horrible mistakes for years, and that he would never do it again. But that's not the right way to think. Really, if you're attracted to a 3-year-old, a baby, that doesn't change. So as an adult, I know now that something should have been done then, because I don't know if there are other victims. None that I know of. What affected me the most is the years after, and dealing with that only internally. And as a young child, not knowing how to deal with it, from expressing what happened to dealing with what happens later. When you're a victim of child sexual abuse, a couple of things can happen. 1, you don't care for sex. 2, you become very promiscuous.
When were you able to talk about that? What your experience?
When I finally I actually really only remembered when I had my oldest son. I read up on it, and I've gone to counseling for years about it, and and then I have medical doctor and MSW friends that have helped me work through issues. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Nikki. But it became really clear when I had my oldest child, and then I became just militant about expressing what could happen to my boys so that nothing would happen to them. I sort of accept things that I would never, ever accept for anybody that I love. I knew this is very severe, but I knew that when my boys were growing up, that if anything ever happened to them like that, the perpetrator would be dead and I would be in jail. I was committed to that. I know that that's very severe. My boys are both grown and old, but I was 100% committed that I did not want them to have to deal with that. They sort of had to deal with some aftermath with issues that I have had my entire life. But I knew that was one thing that I would always protect them from. So I was very sort of graphic, really, about